When the Stanley Parable was released, it was a revelation. Many saw it as one of the best narrative-oriented games yet released, and it ushered in a whole wave of walking simulators that generally did not do things quite as well as the game that started a lot of that trend. However, one of the two people who worked on the Stanley Parable went on to start his own company and release his own games. There are not many of those games, but the first of them was the unwieldingly titled Dr. Langeskov the Tiger and the Terribly Cursed Emerald, a Whirlwind Heist, which I will only be referring to as Dr. Langeskov from now on. This game shares some of the DNA of the Stanley Parable and is quite similarly oriented around a response to gaming itself. It does not go as in-depth as the Stanley Parable, but it does not need to. It never overstays its welcome in what it wants to do. And what it wants to do is reveal a certain artifice behind the production of games, but not a realistic revealing of the artifice, but an artificial revealing. In Dr. Langeskov, you play as some person who is supposed to play the game, but you have arrived at an inopportune time. So instead of playing the game, you need to help the narrator trigger the necessary events for the person who is actually playing the game. The narrator, who should be an authoritative figure, if, standard narrative convention is followed, is instead a bumbling character who fumbles his duties as he is forced to rely on a player. The artifice of the authorial narrator who controls everything is laid bare through this setup, and it is obviously done for comedic effect, but that does not change the fact that this is what is presented to us. Furthermore, Dr. Langeskov goes against many gaming conventions alongside its breakage of many narrative ones by limiting player interaction overall. There is very little that you are actually able to do in this game. You have been charged by the narrator with interacting with various levers and buttons to get the person who is actually playing the game to experience it as it is meant to be experienced. But they are little more than button presses from your player perspective. And there is no skill or ability in it for you. You generally just walk around and do whatever you have been told to do. This could also be something we might say of the walking simulator genre in general. The name of this genre is often levied as an insult, but it has been co-opted and generally reclaimed by those who do appreciate the genre for its attempts to tell an interactive narrative without the need for what we traditionally associate with gameplay elements. Dr. Langeskov does this incredibly well too, because the lack of interaction itself forms part of the narrative as a whole. You have a complete lack of typical interactions with the world, but on top of that, you also have a lack of overall choice. This is not your story after all. The story is for the person who you are helping the narrator with. This other person is playing the actual game, and you are there to do whatever the narrator tells you to do, so that the real player gets to experience the game as it is meant to be played. Of course, the true artifice of it all is that you are the player, and the character that the narrator calls the player is just an NPC you indirectly interact with throughout the course of the game. But in terms of meta-narrative storytelling, this is an enjoyable way to do exactly that. There cannot be any choices for you because you are not playing the game. You are basically serving as the code that resides behind the scenes that triggers the necessary events in the correct sequence. This behind-the-scenes approach to storytelling makes Dr. Langeskov a very interesting experience overall. In the real behind-the-scenes of a game, there is no person like us who is triggering everything for someone else to play. Instead, there is code that has been established to trigger at the necessary points to activate what needs to happen next. In the real world, those triggering events can also glitch out and force us as the player to reload a save or something similar. This means that even the behind-the-scenes of Dr. Langeskov is an artifice. There is no behind-the-scenes like this in any game. Games are a hodgepodge of compromises and illusions. When you tinker around in the code of many games or activate a no-clip mode, you can often find inaccessible rooms filled with items that spawn in the game because the engine doesn't allow you to just make them from nothing. Or there might be a whole map located far below the actual game map because it's an indoor location that can't exist on the same map as the rest of the game. The behind the scenes of real games is messy and disorganized. This is a carefully orchestrated and artificially realized look at what the back end of a game can pretend to be. This pretending for the sake of comedy is what gives Dr. Langeskov its entertaining allure. This game is a fun little thing and it's very short at around 15 minutes in length. It may have hailed from the same kind of mentality that gave us the Stanley Parable, but it is more than happy to do its own thing with the ideas that could also be found in that much more famous game. Pretending for the sake of play is one of the oldest things that many of us have done. We play to have fun, and sometimes we don't have all we need to have that fun, so we pretend and imagine. Video games simply give a tangible air to the imaginary ideas many of us once played around with as young people. And Dr. Langeskov gives us yet another of those imagined spaces, as it asks us to be in on the running of a game rather than the playing of it. But it makes us play while doing so. All the Artifice is there to give you a good time, and that's all it needs to be.